Welcome to the award-winning Superhuman Academy podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to give you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Greetings, SuperFriends, and welcome to this week's episode, which is dedicated to Brooke Craven from the United States of America, who left an awesome 5-star review titled Awesome Podcast. Jonathan, host of the Becoming Superhuman, now Superhuman Academy podcast, aims to motivate, inspire, and more in this can't-miss podcast. The host and expert guests offer insightful advice and information that is helpful to anyone that listens. Wow. Thank you so much, Brooke. We really do appreciate these reviews. And if you haven't left one, what's it going to cost you? 5 minutes? So leave a review. Thank you. On to today's episode. Guys and gals, today we are joined by Sanjay Rawal. He is a documentary filmmaker who has created such documentaries as Food Chains, which was produced by Ava Longoria and Eric Schlosser, with narration from Forest Whitaker, and his most recent documentary, 3100 Run and Become, which was released theatrically in the US in 20 markets last fall. His third effort, Gather, is a documentary on Native American food sovereignty and is set for completion in mid-2019. Why did we want to talk to a documentary filmmaker? Well, Sanjay has a unique perspective in that he has looked at two of the biggest aspects of becoming superhuman. One, food and how it gets to us and our food chain. And two, the extreme periphery edge of human performance, mainly 3,100 miles. Yes, people who run 3,100 miles. I wanted to talk to Sanjay because I wanted to understand what he learned in his years of interviewing and talking with these people and what advice he can give us about better living our lives as superhumans. It turned out to be an incredibly interesting conversation. I learned a lot. I had my mind blown at least once, and I think you are going to feel the same. So please welcome my new super friend, Sanjay Rawal. Mr. Sanjay Rawal, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Hope you're well too.
Yeah, doing well. Trying to brave the heat and humidity here, but otherwise pretty happy and contented.
Good.
Yeah. So Sanjay, for folks who don't know you, I'm of course going to try and cover as much as I can in the bio, but tell me a little bit about who you are and most interestingly, from my perspective, how you became that person.
Well, I was a kind of a bumbling, directionless college student, and decided.
Is there any other kind?
Well, I felt like I was the only one. I felt like everybody else knew what they were doing, right? And I had a choice of going to grad school and pleasing my parents, or moving across the country from Oakland, California, to New York, and starting an inner education, basically placing my fate in the hands of an Indian spiritual teacher who lived in New York named Sri Chinmoy. I studied neurobiology in college, but he quickly had me doing work for friends of his that ran big humanitarian organizations. And those friends included such illustrious souls as Desmond Tutu. So as a 20-year-old and in my 20s, just by virtue of this mentor, I had experiences which I don't think I ever would have gotten. And so I ended up working in the human rights field for about 15 years in about 40 countries, and gradually found my way moving towards telling people stories. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been a documentary filmmaker.
Very cool. I love that you started out telling your story with just the importance that one mentor can make. I think this is something you and I really agree on, that mentors are perhaps more important than the kind of official education that you get on paper, because they can just open so many doors for you. How did you meet this mentor? How did you ingratiate yourself?
Well, I went to the University of California in Berkeley, which
Go Bears!
Of course people know. Oh, are you a Bear?
Oh yeah.
Oh my God! So I grew up in Oakland, went to Cal starting in '92. And, it's like you can find anything in Berkeley. And more often than not, people of esoteric traditions, of Eastern traditions, of mystical traditions aren't so unusual and aren't so out there as they might be in other places. And in my freshman year, discontented with who I was and what my relationships were like, I effectively started like looking for something else, and went to every single spiritual group I could get my hands on, that at least the ones I could afford. And by my sophomore year, I'd come across the teachings of Sri Chinmoy, who then was a guru in New York City. But unlike most of the teachings that I'd come across, he very much advocated living in the world. And he felt that the only way to really transform oneself and transforming the world in this modern day and age was to be in it. And that appealed to me because I didn't think I was ready to go live in a cave, in the Himalayan mountains. And it was a slow and steady journey from there. He asked his students to kind of apply a level of discipline to their lives that didn't seem kind of like popular in college, like no drinking, no drugs, a lot more kind of personal discipline than I'd expected. But when I started practicing it, meditation, prayer, reading, studying, I found it did a lot more for my mental clarity than anything else I was doing as a student.
Wow. Now, I think a lot of people, when they hear the term mentor, they kind of think like, well, why would someone mentor me? What do I have to offer? And I think what I love about your story is you were in this place of uncertainty. I mean, you were still wet behind the ears, a freshman in college with kind of no direction. How did you become someone that this person wanted to give to and wanted to develop?
I'm still surprised, at the luck I had. And, when it comes to teachers of mystical traditions, whether they're from the East, the Middle East, from Europe, from indigenous cultures in the West, luckily for the student, they're using more than just their mental faculties. So they're not looking at your resume. They're not asking you to write essays. They're using their own mystical ability to ask the divine, to ask the supreme if they are meant to be your teacher. Wow. And if they get that affirmation, then they do it. And essentially, they start from a place of potential, not from judgment and not from analysis.
I love that. One more question on this, and then I know we have a whole lot of ground to cover. But any tips out there to folks who are saying, maybe I should have a mentor too?
I have to say, a lot of us these days hear over and over the benefits of individuality, of being your own teacher, or the guru is within. But it's a fallacy. I mean, for tens of thousands of years, people have learned about their true nature by surrendering their ego. I mean, even think about the Karate Kid, the movie. It's like Ralph Macchio had to learn obedience before he could receive the teachings of Mr. Miyagi. Mm-hmm. And that aspect of obedience, of trust, we look at as being natural when we go to a gym teacher, for example, or to go to a personal trainer, where if you want to get the physical results you need, you listen. But when it comes to personal development, we don't seem to want to have that same level of surrender. So I would say to people, find a teacher. You need a teacher for a spiritual path. Even if that teacher is no longer in the physical and you're just studying his or her books, and devote yourself to that teacher. Ask the divine, ask the supreme, ask whomever you see as the highest to allow you to fully absorb those teachers' teachings. And that's the way that human beings have always made spiritual progress. And I don't think it's changed just because of modernity.
I really love everything that you're saying. And I, in a lot of ways, am kind of the poster boy for autodidactic learning. But in reality, I mean, if you look at the way that I learn, sure, I learn very quickly and I absorb, but I almost always have mentors and teachers. I think people sometimes get the wrong impression that I sit in a room when I want to learn something and I just learn it by myself with all the techniques that we teach. But I have had so many mentors, teachers, friends, peers that have taught me so much along the way that are invaluable. I mean, talk about like a smart cut. Find someone who's devoted their life to learning this the hard way and then learn it from them.
Exactly. I mean, if you were to climb up a dangerous mountain who better to go with you than someone who's climbed that mountain before?
Absolutely. So you transition out of the world of nonprofits and helping people, and you realize that really your calling is going to be telling these people's stories. Would you say that's your superpower, or what would you say your superpower is?
It's interesting because when you try to tell someone's story, you're doing something inherently exploitative. You're taking something really important to that person. You're, in some senses, repackaging it to fit a certain format. In my case, documentary film. And there's a tendency to really insert one's own vision or one's own ego into that process. I would have never thought of myself as being a good listener in my 20s, but now, and I'm still not a great listener when it comes to conversations, but when it comes to telling people stories, I think my superpower is, if I can even call it a superpower, is to find ways to allow people's own stories to blossom, and that just takes, I guess, the ability of pulling myself and my desires completely out of the equation.
Being something of a vehicle for the story to be told.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because, it's a profession for me. So it's like you want your own personal success. You want a little bit of the glory. You want to see your name in lights. But when it comes to at least documentary filmmaking, that can be a pitfall, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the first documentary that you created.
Well, I made several short films, and they happened to do pretty well, and that gave me the encouragement to do something bigger and more traditional. And my father was in agriculture. He was in the tomato industry in California, and around the world, I'd worked on issues of labor relations and agricultural human rights. But it shocked me to learn in the West, in Israel, in Europe, in the U.S. in particular, that labor practices in food were, in some cases, actually many cases, they were terrible. And despite the sheen of supermarkets and labels like organic, there was no transparency with regard to the conditions of people on the ground. And I began following this group of tomato pickers in South Florida called the CIW. And what they did was revolutionary. Rather than just going to farmers and advocating for better conditions, because farmers are being squeezed on both ends of the stick, they went all the way to the top, to the companies that were buying the tomatoes they picked. And that was everyone from McDonald's to Walmart. And they demanded that those companies, number one, pay a penny more per pound for the tomatoes they were purchasing from these farms. And number two, demand that the farms instituted a real human rights code and a real, trackable human rights system. And through protest, through public awareness across the span of a couple of decades, they absolutely transformed Florida's tomato industry from a place where, real true modern day slavery wasn't a shock, and where every day, a female farm worker would likely experience either mild harassment or the worst type of sexual harassment.
Wow.
And I was lucky to work with Eva Longoria and Forest Whitaker on that project.
Incredible. What did you learn? I mean, what were your takeaways about the food that we eat, about how that plays out for everyday people who eat that food?
It really ties to a project that I'm almost wrapping up about the Native American food system in the United States. We talk about going more local. We talk about becoming sustainable, but it's difficult for us to realize that, a couple hundred years ago, all of the food systems were local. All of them were small. Now, naysayers will say that, 200 years ago, the population of the earth was nowhere near what it is right now. And techniques then were primitive. And in part, modern technology, especially when it comes to growing organics, is definitely advanced. But at the same time, we actually had a relationship with our food. And you'll see with many, many cultures the deep ceremony around food and the gathering, the community aspect of food, and how when we value food, we value environment. We understand that if the environment is terrible and polluted, we could starve. In this day and age, with convenience and the idea of really exploitation in the food chain and saying, like, if the blueberry season in the northeastern US isn't as good as it normally has been, we can still get blueberries from New Zealand or from Chile. We haven't had to deal with scarcity in the way that our ancestors have had to. And because of that, we don't have the same relationship and love of the environment. And so I see the story with food as much more than just climate change. It's the fact that what we've done to the environment, because of our disconnect with it, is going to end up really harming us as a society or as a civilization, because our food systems are being destroyed.
So I know this is maybe like a cliche question to ask, but you've really been boots on the ground much more than any so-called thought leader or nutrition expert or organic kind of food proponent. I mean, you've really seen the dirt under people's fingernails, and you've seen the pain that this broken system is causing. How can we, as consumers, do something to improve this?
I'll take a step back. If we look at how we evolve, it's obviously we're passing on our genes to the next generation. And survival of the fittest didn't mean that you were adapted better to a desert than you were to a forest, because we know that human beings, our bodies are pretty resilient. You put on, heavy clothing, which humans have always had, and you could live in the Arctic. You take it off, you can pretty much live in the tropics. Our adaptations came from our ability to digest the food around us. If you were Inuit in Alaska, for example, and you couldn't digest fat, that was it for you. You would die and you wouldn't pass on your genes. So our bodies have become adapted to certain foods that our ancestors ate. Now, none of us are eating those foods right now. We're all eating this globalized supermarket diet. And not to say that it's bad. Cherry tomatoes and mesclun lettuce, they taste good. But there are plenty of things in that food system that are totally unnatural. So I think people have to ask themselves, it's an interesting kind of anthropological study. Try to find out what was in the pantries of your grandparents. Or if your grandparents are still alive, ask them what was in the pantries of their great-grandparents. And you'll get a sense of the nutrition that led to your evolution. And you'll get a sense for the types of food, the types of preparations, the simplicity that created our genetic makeup.
That's awesome. And that's really sound advice. It's like, don't eat processed artificial crap, eat real food. And that's going to be better for you. It's going to be better for the environment. It's going to be better for the people who produce your food, because there's less exploitation in the system when you're not creating frankenfoods and not so obsessed with output. I think that's really wise.
We have to take small steps to discovering, or rediscovering our food system. And it really comes from personal stories. Right. Find out your family's relationship with food and try to make that more a part of your life.
Also, and that's a nice kind of alley-oop to what I was going to say, plant a garden. Figure out how food grows. Figure out what goes into growing fresh food. I have many friends in Silicon Valley. It became very trendy to buy chickens and let the chickens run around and get fresh eggs every once in a while. Understand what it takes for a chicken to lay an egg. Understand what it takes to grow cherry tomatoes, because it's not easy. It takes water and it takes attention and it takes love. And I think you can't get any more local than 10 feet outside your porch. I think we'd all be a lot better off if we grew at least some of our own food.
I agree. And for people who have gardens, they know that the taste of vegetables when you've harvested them a minute ago is completely different than when they've sat in trucks and on supermarket shelves.
Oh my God, yes.
The best salad that you're ever going to have in your life is the one that you grew, not just because of some lovey-dovey spiritualism, but because it actually tastes better.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, I'm completely spoiled when it comes to tomatoes and strawberries because my parents grew them in the backyard and I would pick them, and my mom used to always say like tomatoes never make it through the back door. I would eat them on the way from the vine to the kitchen, and it's like a different animal entirely versus something that's grown in the supermarket. There's just no comparison. It doesn't leave any smell on your hands because it has no smell, because it was never actually ripe. It was treated with ethylene gas to make it look red and look ripe. It's not ripe.
Exactly. And at the same time, modern science is just beginning to unlock the power of what they call the microbiome, our bacterial interaction with our environment. And a lot of the beneficial bacteria comes through interacting with the environment. It's as simple or as silly as that sounds. It comes from the hands that touch your food. It comes from you working in the ground. It comes from you bringing in your vegetables. Our connection with our environment has always been based in large part around food. That's the only way we actually transfer energy from the environment into us. We're not plants. We're not getting energy from the sun. And so it's like it's much more than calories. It's much more than macronutrients. It's literally all the little things that come into us when we become part of our food system.
All right, at this point, I want to pause and take a moment to thank our sponsor, Four Sigmatic, who is making it easy for everyday people to unlock the incredible health benefits of mushrooms. I originally learned about Four Sigmatic when I met their founder at a conference in 2015, and I have been pretty much obsessed with their products ever since. Personally, I use their reishi mushroom tea most nights for an all-natural sleep aid. I carry their chaga immunity blend anytime I travel. And I've also pretty much switched out my usual coffee or yerba mate for their unbelievably awesome mushroom coffee, either in ground or in instant form. Now, what I love about the mushroom coffee is that it combines chaga for immune support with lion's mane for intense focus. And because of that, I actually find it to be more effective than most nootropics or stimulants, including Ritalin, despite having only 40 milligrams of caffeine. It's honestly insane. If you haven't tried out their products, I strongly, strongly recommend you do so. And to encourage you to give them a try, we've actually teamed up with Four Sigmatic to bring you an incredible 15% discount. To take advantage of that, just visit foursigmatic.com/superhuman today. All right, back to the show. Sanjay, you made, after this food documentary with Eva Longoria, what I would say is a really, really logical and smart move into another subject, which was exercise at the extreme end of the spectrum. Tell me a bit about that.
There is a race in my neighborhood in New York City called the SelfTranscendence 3,100-mile race. And it was actually founded by my mentor, Sri Chinmoy, 23 years ago now. And the summer I moved to New York, this race started. It's on the surface, it's outlandish. People have to run 60 miles a day, at least in the 52-day window, 60 miles a day per day in the 52-day window in order to reach 3,100 miles. And it's all held around a half-mile loop in Queens, New York City. And it's officially the world's longest race. And so when I moved to New York, that race scared me. And it took me about 20 years to realize that, people who were doing that race, coming from around the world to attempt it, they weren't crazy. They weren't, in essence, they didn't have any capacities that I didn't have. They weren't strange in any kind of perverse love for pain. They were just able to find happiness in any situation. Even when their body was being physically punished, they could find happiness. And I found that as an extraordinary ability. And so I decided to make a movie, not just about this race, or I should say primarily about this race, but to show how the ability to find power from within, particularly through physical activity, and to channel that power to transform one's lives, that wasn't a new thing, and it wasn't just the possession of this race. And so we traveled to traditional running cultures like the Navajo Nation in Arizona, to the Kalahari in Botswana, where the San Bushmen have been hunting on foot hunting game much larger, much more powerful than human beings. And they've been doing so for 125,000 years. And to the highlands of Japan, where a small esoteric sect of Buddhist monks, walk and run for 1,000 days for enlightenment. And we interwove all those stories into the attempt of a paperboy from Finland who was trying to accomplish the goal of reaching 3,100 miles in this race in Queens.
Wow. Now, I'm going to ask again because you said it, but I don't believe it. These are normal people?
Yeah. So the movie I made is called 3,100 Run and Become, and we focus on a fellow who delivers papers in Finland, and a woman who's a professional cellist and cello teacher in Austria. And on the surface, neither of them look like world-class athletes. But as people will tell you over and over and over, the champions are those who understand the power of the heart. The champions, they say, are the ones that have heart. They're the ones that have grit. In a sense, it's like any of us can be that champion if we cultivate our spiritual qualities, if we understand how to use joy, use happiness to destroy problems in our lives. And this particular race is a great petri dish because it's on a sidewalk in New York. And in the summer, when the race is held, it's hot, it's rainy, it's sticky, everyone gets blisters. You get dehydrated, you've got to eat 10,000 calories a day. It's hard on your body, but can you pull joy out of your heart? And can that joy eliminate the pain that you're feeling and minimize the problems that you're having? And in this race, the only way to complete it is to do that. It's a remarkable lens into the powers that we have access to in our day-to-day lives, which many of us don't cultivate to the degree that we perhaps should.
That's incredible. It kind of boggles the mind that people do this willingly. I wonder, so you got to spend a fair amount of time with some of these folks, including this Norwegian fella.
That's correct. And we're doing our wonderful conversation in July, and the race is happening right now. And even though I'm not filming this edition of the race, I'm out there pretty much every day, working on people, doing some body work on people, and just as a general volunteer. I mean, it's like a temple for self-transcendence, the idea of going beyond your capacity. These people are trying to do it at every single second, and it's actually, frankly, it's really inspiring.
Incredible. How do people cultivate this ability? I mean, I always wonder, since starting the podcast, I have built a lot more tenacity. I have discovered through talking to people who've run ultra marathons or who have trained for these types of extreme challenges. I've really learned a lot about being able to push myself and knowing that there's a lot more after I say, oh my God, I can't go any further. But I'm just curious how people cultivate this. I mean, did they share this with you, or are they able to put their finger on what they did to develop this capacity?
That's a great question. And this is why we spent some time with traditional running cultures. We were just talking about like humankind's relationship with food. Humankind has also had an incredible relationship with our feet. And again, it's something that we don't cultivate in day-to-day life. Like we don't connect with our food system. We don't connect with our feet. We're sitting all day. We're sedentary. But back in the day, so to speak, if you didn't have a relationship with your feet and you couldn't move, you were dead. And understanding the power of motion, understanding the fact that our feet connect us to our environment really was a very important mystical element of life. For example, the Navajo say that when you run, your feet are praying to Mother Earth. Your lungs are breathing in Father Sky. And just through the act of that motion, you are praying to the Creator. You are asking him or her for their blessings, to make you a better person. And you're showing the Creator that you're willing to work for those blessings. The Kalahari Bushmen, who are a window into the way we all evolved, they will chase animals for 2 days through the desert, pushing them further and further away from watering holes until they can catch up to them, get close enough to them to kind of kill them with pretty rudimentary weaponry. And, evolutionary biologists will say that our only advantage on the savannah was our ability to endure long distances. But the Kalahari Bushmen say, no, like when they chase these animals by foot, it's an act of prayer, and their prayers are amplified through motion. And we know that from pilgrimage. Human beings have made pilgrimages for millennia. And it's that same idea that when you use your body, when you use your feet, your prayers can be amplified. And I see that, as weird as this all sounds, like in this 3,100-mile race, these really ordinary people who don't come from indigenous cultures or traditional running cultures, this is something they discover because it's who we all are.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that it's much more a spiritual and emotional training than it is really a physical training.
Very much so. And, a lot of folks have realized, even through modern science, that there are practices like, putting your feet in the ground. It's called grounding. Staring at the sun with your feet in the ground creates an electromagnetic relationship between our body and the earth. There are definitely ways that our body has related to the earth, and that's come through the relationship of our bare feet on the ground. And again, it's something that we don't really cultivate. When we look at exercise these days, it's much more about look or about capacity or about performance than it is about relationship. And so I've always been a runner, but my running has totally changed. My physical fitness regime has totally changed because of this movie, because I've realized that physical fitness can actually make me a better person if that's my intention. So now I go into my runs, I go into my physical activities, with an open heart and open mind. And rather than trying to feel a sense of aggression or a sense of performance, I try to cultivate happiness through exertion. A Hopi elder once said to a group of us who were running through the Hopi Nation in Arizona, he said, as a way to bless us on this run that we were doing, he said, find joy through exertion. And that to me was deeply penetrating. Find joy through exertion. If you can learn to find joy through exertion, you've unlocked something very, very special. And that superpower can be applied to any aspect of your life, and it will eliminate, the power of most of the things that cause us problems.
I love that. It's really fascinating because I do see in myself this, I enjoy the competition of my workouts. I enjoy competing against myself or competing against others or seeing if I can do my best. I hate the exertion part of it. And I think maybe I could stand to change that. I think a lot of us could stand to change that. I mean, it says everything that like most of us can't work out without music because we need to distract ourselves from the experience that we're enduring.
I agree. And, in my own kind of experience running track, you develop the determination, you exert, and then you enjoy the result. But I'm trying to learn how to enjoy the exertion. Because even if you do an hour-long workout in the gym, it's like, boom, I've started, and my satisfaction comes when I'm done. But like, in that sense, I've lost a whole hour. I've lost an hour where I've just distracted myself or just focused myself. And how can I find the moments of real happiness in that activity, in that exertion? I'm not a pro at it, but I've realized that that's a new challenge.
Incredible. And so what are some of the, I'm dying to know, what are some of the ramifications on these people's bodies? I mean, I don't imagine they walk away from this unscathed.
It depends on the person. And I've done some, they call them multi-day races, 6-day races. And, you're not running at a high aerobic output. Your heart's not beating wildly. And so as people have experienced through fasting, there comes a time after 1 or 2 days where despite the absence of calories in, the person fasting is feeling energetic. Obviously that's coming from burning fat and from a different, aspect of metabolism around ketones. I've seen that running very, very slowly or walking, pretty long distances is actually a healing activity. I've seen through the runners, despite the large number of miles, that when they continue in motion, that circulation is flushing out the inflammation, it's flushing out the broken down tissue. After the race, however, it's a different story. They usually say that if you run a really hard marathon, 26.2 miles, it takes about 26 days to fully recover. 3,100 miles, 3,100 days is effectively like 7 to 8, around 8 years. It doesn't take that long for people to recover, but people who've done the race, a number of them don't take a single step running for anywhere from 5 months to 7 months. There's just a lot of pounding. There's a lot of residual inflammation around the joints. But at the same time, people who are climbing massive mountains and who are really exerting themselves on expeditions, maybe losing 10 to 20% of their body weight, it'll also take them 3 to 4 to 5 months to fully come back to the person they were before that physical exertion.
That makes sense. Takeaways or what's some homework? Because I want to give people a practical takeaway that they can then implement based on all that you've learned from these incredible human beings. And I don't know if there is something. I mean, what would you say? Like, what would be the homework for this podcast episode?
I would imagine that the majority of your awesome listeners have some sort of exercise regime. And whether it's being in the gym, whether it's biking, whether it's running, I would say as an exercise, to try to develop a different set of goals around that exercise practice. I would say to try to approach physical fitness with the idea of it transforming you into a better person. And that sounds esoteric, but like, number one, change your intention. Go into your workout not necessarily for performance, but to try to find ways to enjoy it. And very often that comes from unplugging from your phone, from your playlist, or choosing a playlist that's much more meditative, much more, flowing. Try to understand, where your mind is when you work out. If you're thinking about the result or if you're thinking about the process. There's an ancient Indian saying from where I'm from East India, that basically says you have the right to act, but not to the fruits thereof. And it's a different way of framing your action. And essentially, it's showing you how to find happiness in the action and not attach your happiness to the results. I found in particular that the easiest way to unlock that feeling is to approach things with the sense of gratitude. And that includes exercise. If you try to cultivate a feeling of gratitude and thanks for being where you are, who you are, getting to do what you're doing in that moment, that's the easiest and quickest way to understand and feel the transformational power of physical fitness. And I've learned that from these runners. These 3,100-mile runners are trying to cultivate a sense of gratitude, every day, every mile, every lap of this course, because that gratitude unlocks your ability to transcend physical pain and any other limitations.
Incredible. Really, really incredible. And again, still kind of mind-blowing to me that people willingly submit themselves to this, but I think I think you have to compare it to not a marathon, but perhaps compare it to why do people go and join a monastery for a few years at a time?
I agree. The people don't sign up for this race unless they want to have an experience of transformation. Because you're not running through a forest. It's not a beautiful experience of outer running. This race bills itself as one of the only races that can guarantee that the participants will be different people when they finish. And it's like when someone says, I'm going to go to Nepal and climb this mountain. You know that even if you don't make it to the top, the experience of attempting that expedition is going to make you a changed person when you come home. Absolutely.
So, Sanjay, I want to, because you spent so much time around people of this caliber, I want to learn a little bit more about you. What are some of the skills, habits, or routines that you do that you feel make you perform at a higher level?
I have realized that my worst quality is my sense of expectations of myself and trying to pin my satisfaction or my identity to results. Basically, a metaphor that I've read in a number of East Indian spiritual texts, that if a child is holding her mother's finger, an infant, like a 2-year-old holding his mother's finger, and the child gets distracted and lets go, it's easy for the child to fall down and get hurt. But if the mother is holding the child's hand, it doesn't matter how distracted the child gets. The mother is taking the child to the destination. And so I try to cultivate a relationship with the world where I am like that child whose hand is held. And as esoteric or as impractical as this might sound, I try very much to feel how insignificant I am in the scope, not just of the world, but in my own life, how minute by minute actions that I might do that I might consider as mistakes or as successes are really immaterial in terms of the greater world. In essence, it's trying to cultivate a practice of humility, which is everything against what I've been taught in the West, and in essence against my own personal nature. But I find that if I try to cultivate that practice of humility through my meditations, through my running, through my interactions with other people, and try to become a better listener, I end up over the course of days and months and years, accomplishing a lot more than I could have ever imagined.
I really like that. That's not a common answer at all. I think I really like it. I like this idea of remembering like how insignificant your problems and your daily kind of trials are, because we're all living in this narrative that is pretty much 100% centered around us and our perspective of how life happens to us, but it's so insignificant.
I agree. It's like if I tell myself, like, not in a kind of self-flagellating or way or from a place of insecurity, if I tell myself, like, I am nothing, I'm totally insignificant, no one is going to remember anything I've done, it's actually oddly freeing. It releases me from being overly attached or feeling this sense of importance, in the world and other people's lives, that, hurts the way I interact with the world and other people ultimately.
It's funny you say that, because I often wonder, I really like to read biographies of very great people. And I often wonder how they deal with that. Like, how does someone like Elon Musk deal with the fact that he's not nothing and he's potentially changing the course of human history, and he better get it right, because we're really depending on him.
At the same time, I wonder how, and I don't know Elon, but I wonder how people, in those positions of power would react by saying, like, chances are, there's a very good chance in 1,000 years, no one will care who you are. No one will care about your legacy. No one will look at you the way you do. Do you love yourself? Do you have a relationship with something greater than yourself? And if you don't, if your ego, and again, I don't know Elon at all, but if your ego is driving your actions, you'll be forgotten, you'll be left to the dust of human history. But if you're a really good person, like a Mother Teresa, you're not just going to live on, you're going to live in people's hearts. And what do you want to be remembered for?
Totally. Which brings us back, because I do want to ask, you said that you learned about your mentor and his teachings through some of his work that you read. Where's a good starting point if people want to learn more about these teachings?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. There's a couple of great books of his on Amazon, and one of them is simply called Meditation. And his name is spelled S-R-I. Second name is C-H-I-N as in Nancy, M-O-Y, Sri Chinmoy. So there's a book called Meditation, which is like, oh my God, it's like the simplest, most natural book I've come across to demystify meditation. And there's another book called Sport and Meditation that includes a lot of his conversations with folks like Carl Lewis, with great athletes, and looks at through an insightful approach, looks at their abilities to transcend through a spiritual lens, and kind of shows people how they could apply those same techniques to their day-to-day life and to their day-to-day practice of sport and physical fitness. I think those are two great places to start.
Fantastic. And we will put those in the show notes for people to check out. I just have realized that we're pretty much coming up on time here. So I do want to give you an opportunity to let people know where they can reach out, where they can learn more about you, check out your films, check out all the stuff that you're doing.
Well, my first film, Food Chains, I believe is available on Hulu, and it might be available on YouTube. There was a film I made, a short film on Sri Chinmoy's physical fitness called Challenging Impossibility, which is on Vimeo. And my latest movie, 3100, Run and Become, is available in most countries on Apple iTunes and Amazon. You can find me on Instagram at Mr. Sanjay R and at 3100 Film. And you could check out 3100 Film on Instagram for daily updates of the 3100 mile race this summer.
Awesome. I got to check that out. It has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. And I look forward to just seeing what you continue to do, Sanjay. I really appreciate you coming on the show. One last thing I do want to ask you. If people take away one big message from this episode and they carry it with them for the rest of their lives, what would you hope for that message to be?
Oh, that's a heavy question. First of all, right? I want to thank you, Jonathan. This has been a great opportunity. I've been an admirer of yours for a while now, and
well, thank you.
Getting a chance to connect with you has been great. In terms of one takeaway, I would say all of our fates are intertwined. Whether you feel a sense of connection with the entire world or just with your family and your neighbors, develop that connection, cultivate it, and realize that it's that connection with other human beings. It's one of the greatest things that we have as human beings. Make yourself a better person in your life, make yourself a better person in other people's lives. And I think, we'll have a chance as a species.
I love it. Sanjay, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Thanks for tuning in to the award-winning Superhuman Academy podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit superhuman.blog. While you're at it, please take a moment to share this episode with a friend and leave us a review on iTunes. We'll see you next week.